family stories. The question is, how do you learn from it? How do you respond to it? How are you affected by it in a positive fashion? Dr. Eger writes in her book, I began to formulate a new relationship with my own trauma. For me, two very important takeaways from her critically acclaimed book. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Norman Blumenthal to speak with Dr. Eger. Dr. Eger, we are fortunate that you have joined us this evening. Dr. Blumenthal.
Thank you very much. And suffice it to say, there are certain people who have words that are inspiring, and there's certain people whose life is inspiring. Our guest tonight is someone whose both words and her life is very inspiring, and it's a great honor to be part of this conversation. But I'm going to give you a warning, Dr. Eger, and I think you know this term. Expect a lot of transference from me. My mother of blessed memory, Gita Blumenthal, born Gita Cartagena, survived 7 concentration camps. She, like yourself, at the ripe old age of 40, registered herself in college, got a professional certificate in school psychology, and at the unenviable age of 64, completed a doctoral dissertation from Columbia in gifted education. Thank you. Dissertation and everything. So if I call you mommy in the middle of the interview, you'll understand that it's only my transference. But I'd like to start actually with a story that my mother told me and use that as a segue into our first question, if that's okay with you. When I worked up the courage to tell my mother that I was doing my dissertation on children of Holocaust survivors, she was quite shocked. And she told me the following story. My mother at that time was fluent in 6 languages. And she was liberated from Bergen-Belsen, and the British used her as an interpreter. In fact, she told me she could speak to just about everybody but the Hungarians, that she couldn't speak to them. But so because of her exalted status, one day they told her that there was a film made of Bergen-Belsen on the day of liberation, and they invited her to come to attend for a special showing of this film. And of course, it's 1945. So it's a black and white film. There's no sound, none of the smells, colors. There was a poor portrayal of the camp. And she said she sat in the tent and cried and said, no one will know. No one will ever know. And in that context, we're looking for you to give us so much of your wisdom for this new initiative we have for National Trauma Day. We want to take lessons from your life to share with those who have been victimized by vehicular accidents, suicides, falls, aneurysms. Is it really possible to extrapolate from the Holocaust that was so different from anything and everything we've experienced to United States of America 2022?
I think you are so brilliantly pointing out that genocide is with us as we speak, but never in a history of mankind such a systematic and scientific annihilation of people existed when 15 highly educated people were celebrating in the evening that they can put 30,000 Jews in the oven without gassing them. So it's not comparable. And I think each of us have a way of telling everyone what was the difference between a victim, the victimizer, what's the difference between reacting or responding. And I think you and I know that now. I remember having patients, but one of them was very cute, a son of a survivor. He told me that in school, his friend had white bread, called it Wonder Bread, and on top of that was mayonnaise, and on top of that was a bologna. Okay? He had a Kaiser roll with roast beef, and so he went home and told his mother that he wants to have the Wonder Bread with because because he didn't want to be different. He didn't want to be better than or less than. And so I think it's very, very important for you and I, when we chose to study human behavior and when we studied it, by whether we are finding some good in everything. I remember I was in Israel with a psychiatrist from Poland, and we were looking for the positive effects of suffering. I think suffering makes us stronger. But you can't compare who suffered more, because I was 16 years old and my sister Magda was called at home the gorgeous one and the beautiful one. And I told her that at least twice a day. And in the evening, when they dished out the food, I was an acrobat and I was running back and forth, where I could get a little more soup in that place, so I can eat the soup and save the bread for Magda. When I began to work, I was somehow referred patients to me, and we called it post-traumatic stress disorder. I think we pathologize too much. I think it's better to demythologize. There is no perfect family. There is no us and Harriet. I remember that was many years ago. I think each family has a certain chemistry. I don't know whether you were the firstborn child or not. Are you? You're
I'm the second. Second.
The
But I'm the Ben Yuchid. I'm the only son.
So you are the peacemaker.
Mm-hmm.
You want people to get along with each other. We call the baby in a family charming manipulators. Mm-hmm. If you're a firstborn and you marry a firstborn, you're going to have two bosses. So I think you and I can, spend a lot of time on the order in a family, and we didn't have anything after we were liberated. We had cannibalism one day, and then we wanted to be normal. So most people got married right away because we were lonely, we were skinny, and we were very hungry. Mm-hmm. So we grieve over not what happened, but what we didn't happen. See, when my granddaughter wanted to go to her dance and asked me to buy her a dress, and I did, beautiful dress, Laura Ashley, okay, original. I come home and out of the blue, I'm crying. I don't know the word understand. I don't know that word at all. I don't understand why am I crying when Lindsay just got a beautiful dress for me, and I came to the realization that I'm not crying for what I did and bought a dress for Lindsay. I cried because I never went to a dance. Your mother didn't have any PTSD. There was no such thing. There is a post-traumatic stress reaction to the loss. That yesterday was cannibalism and today I have to be normal. We didn't know what that meant. So there's a great deal to say about the child who is parentized and becomes the parent's parent. And the question I have, when did your childhood end?
Right. I think I was born an adult. But let me ask, actually, what you mentioned, since you referenced your training as a gymnast and as a child, and how that had been aborted. I remember reading in your book. I was very touched when you took your daughter to a gymnastics event, and your reaction to her, the opportunities which you missed. I remember when I went to college at Yeshiva University. It's a small college, but of course, as you know, it's almost exclusively Jewish college, at least at the college level. And we had sports teams, and we were respectable. We weren't great, although now we have a very dominant basketball team. But when I went to college, there was one sport in which we were unbeatable, and that was fencing. And the reason was our fencing coach was the most sought after coach in America, one of the biggest experts. A Hungarian, yes. He was slated to he was going to be in the 1936 Olympics, and he was a sure-in for several gold medals, but because Hitler forbade Jewish athletes, Hungary, like America, by the way, did not allow its Jewish athletes to compete. And his revenge was that he would only coach the yeshiva team. So we had the foremost coach in fencing. So I'm thinking about that. Trauma sometimes aborts life. Trauma sometimes interferes with dreams and with hopes. And the trauma of the Holocaust interfered with your aspirations and your dreams. And if we're going to help someone because of, let's say, an accident, I remember once having to deal with a hockey star who was in a terrible car accident, and it was a question of if he could walk, and he was in high school hockey star. And would he ever be able to play sports again? How would you use your experiences and with this disruption of your dreams to help someone like that?
My sister was the pretty one in my family, and when we were completely naked, she asked me a typical Hungarian question, how do I look? And I had a choice to point out her naked self, but I know that I became a mirror to her. And I said to her, Magda, you have beautiful eyes. And I didn't see it when you had your hair all over the place. So, she still remembers that. She was 100 years old, the 23rd of January.
Wow.
And I told her every day in the camp in Auschwitz, you're beautiful, Magda, and you're gorgeous. So she calls me and she says, I'm gorgeous. And so to get married, to have a child, your mother looks at you as the treasure that she was honored with, and you cannot do wrong. So you may give up your genuine self to be your parents' parent because you learn English. My little girl wrote home a book called Chicken Little. And then comes Goosey Lucy, Turkey Lurkey, so forth and so on. I didn't know Turkey from Lurkey or anything like that. So we became parents when we needed a parents. So the Olympics, of course, bring out a lot of memories for me. I don't know where you are with remembering something that you want to mention it so the audience can go home and take stock of their own lives and realizing that maybe there is some unresolved grief. Because I didn't tell anyone I was in Auschwitz, at least close to 20 years, because I wanted to be a Yankee Doodle Dandy. I wanted to assimilate, and that I wouldn't do that today at all. I just didn't know how to cope and how to be different, not better or worse, but being a survivor, you actually acquire resiliency, and you turn the hatred into pity. I looked at the guards and I thought that they were brainwashed wearing this uniform. They could throw me in a gas chamber any minute. I had no control over that. 4 o'clock when we got up and we stood up, I didn't know whether I'm going to go back to the barracks. I didn't know when I took a shower whether water is going to come out or gas. And I think this is a very, very important point for people to know that we were not prepared for this. And we were told one thing and we found another. And I think it's very wonderful. One of my patients goes to the yeshiva college. Her first name is Nurit. I don't know if you have a Nurit. That's a very unusual name. But anyway, it is wonderful for you and for me. You know, we don't call ourselves a shrink. I call myself a stretch. You know,
That's very good.
we stretch people's vocabulary, that we look at the same thing from a different perspective.
You know, your comment about looking at the guards and having pity on them reminds me of a very, very famous story they tell about one of the great rabbinic figures who survived the Holocaust, known as the Bluzhever Rebbe, the rabbi of Bluzh. And he, at one point, he was being beaten by a Nazi, and the Nazi looked down on this bloodied and injured rabbi, and he said to him, "Rabbi, where's your God now?" And he looked up to me and said, "He's your God too." But I'd like to ask you another question that I think is important also in terms of working with victims of trauma as we have. One of the lessons we've learned when we do this trauma work is that nothing in life is inconsequential. Which seat you took in the car can sometimes be a life and death decision. Where you sat in the train could also be a life and death decision. We saw that very dramatically this past year in the Meron tragedy. If you recall the mountain in Israel, where there was a large celebration and there was a human avalanche afterwards as people were coming down. And one of the themes we heard from survivors and even from parents or family members of those who perished, some were American, was that minor decisions, seemingly minor decisions, were life and death. Which road you took down from the mountain, if you waited 5 minutes for your friend, or if you were rushing down to get to the bus, these all became life and death decisions. And I was reminded of that when I read your book, of two parts of the book. One of them was that phone call that Dr. Mengele got at that nearly devastating moment when he was about to, it looked like he was about to assault you. And that telephone call saved your life. And the other thing I recall, and I know that's painful, and I hope I'm not causing you pain bringing it up, but here I am, childhood survivor, protecting you, right? But when you described how you called your mother, when he asked you, was your mother's your mother, and you said mother, and you didn't say sister, and how that haunted you for so many years. If you're addressing someone who made one of those decisions, who made what seemed like an inconsequential decision, and yet that decision had such effects, how would you draw upon that experience to help them?
I don't know how can I help anybody unless they would want to get help. And I would say something that there is a difference between believing and faith. People say, I believe, I believe, I believe. And I usually have one thing to say. You know, if I knew then what I know now, I would have done things differently. And then here comes, can you forgive yourself? I did not have any idea that forgiveness is not me forgiving you what you did to me. It's a gift that I give to me, that I am able to have faith and not revolving, but evolving. My daughter calls it Edisms. So this is my Edism. That especially if you are in your midlife, you don't have a midlife crisis, you have a midlife transition. And I think that's very important, especially now the year is beginning. And how would you like this year to end? And hopefully you'll be satisfied because you set out to be a good parent to you. And you ask yourself, whatever you're doing, is it important to say? Is it important for me to tell somebody that, that their hair is a little too white or something? Yes, but this, yes, but. And I say, well, try it again. And instead of but, say yes and. Because sometimes we mothers say, you're a beautiful girl, but you're pimply and but you're fat. And I think that if you can really recognize that the way you talk to yourself changes your whole body chemistry, that's powerful.
Well, thank you. You know, it's interesting, and I think I speak for both David and myself. One of the consequences of being a child of survivor is you can't be ordinary, because the statistical likelihood that you would be on this earth is so slim that you have to be something special. You can't just be a regular person. And I always felt that.
I think it takes courage to be average.
That's true.
You know,
That's true.
you know, if you want to do everything just right, you're a perfectionist. And what I know about perfectionism, that it leads to procrastination. I'm human. I'm limited. Yes. So
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I just really hope that people are asking themselves, what am I doing now? And how is it working for me? That you have a goal, I like to call it an arrow that you follow. Because when I came to America on a ship that was for displaced people, we had a big storm as we were passing England, and I noticed that the ship was taken away. But then I noticed that he brought the ship back so we can go to New York instead of China, wherever it was going. So I think you want to hopefully be a good parent to you and really truly be kind to yourself, and knowing that it takes courage just to make a C or even a flunking something, because in your family, that was certainly not accepted. You had to perform because it's my son, the doctor.
Right. There's a tradition, a Jewish tradition, that Hannah, if you know the biblical account, who had infertility and finally was blessed with a child, that she prayed for what was called in Hebrew Zera Anashim, an average child. Of course, it's God's sense of humor that she gave birth to one of the greatest prophets in Jewish history, but she wanted, like you're saying, she wanted an average child. If I could shift the focus, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I am so happy that you are where you are now, and recognizing that being a child of a survivor makes you different, not better or worse.
Sure. In fact, I often think I picked psychology as a career. I used to think it was because I wanted to heal my parents. I've decided that's not it. I think that I spent my entire childhood trying to understand experiences that I couldn't understand. And it set in motion a curiosity about human behavior and an inquisitiveness about that which I can never fully understand, that I think very much governs the work that I do. If I can shift the focus again to another topic that unfortunately, and I have to say really unfortunately, has become one of the foci of the trauma team, and that's the dramatic rise of anti-Semitism. I'm sure you've saw the statistics that in the latest studies, 55% of religious discrimination in this country is perpetrated against Jews. 60% of hate crimes in New York City are perpetrated against Jews. 1 out of 4 American Jews have experienced anti-Semitism in the course of their lifetime, even in today's news. I don't know if you saw it, maybe it's local New York news, but there was a yeshiva in Williamsburg, a Hasidic community, that the school buses that had Yiddish writing on it were spray painted with swastikas, and 2 Hasidic Jews in that community were assaulted at the same time. And we very often are called in when someone is a victim of an anti-Semitic assault, or children, innocent children who are spit at or cursed at because they're Jewish, and we have to try to help them process this in a meaningful way. You certainly were a victim, probably the extreme, the ultimate, in terms of a victim of Jew hatred. Could you maybe share with us how you've coped with that? And could it be some way, a message we could give? We hope there'll be no more, but in case, again, realistically, we have to anticipate there'll be other victims and how we can help them.
I refuse to be a victim in one way. In another way, we are all victims of victims. So that's why you cannot blame, because I don't know how far you go back. I'm very proud as a Jew. I tell you why. I remember that my ancestors were slaves. I did all the research I could. And then when they got out of slavery, they joined Moses and they walked on a desert. My understanding is over 40 years, and they never gave up. That.
Beautiful.
It's not what you say, it's what you do. Love is not what you feel. You are a role model to your children, the way you treat your children's mother. Do you bring her breakfast in bed Saturday morning? Or, my late husband brought me papayas, and red papayas from Mexico. Again, it's not what you feel, is when the question that I also have, would you like to be married to you?
Please don't ask my wife that question. No.
You see, because children don't do what we say, they do what they see.
Right.
Anti-Semitism has been with us from year one. I went to a Jewish school, and when I came out, children were spitting at me and called me Christ killer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm 94 years old. And here we go. I had a young man, 14 years old. He was a member of the David Koresh from Texas. And he told me that he's a boot boy, and I acknowledged his boots. I don't know much about boots at all. But then he got up and he put his elbow on my desk and he said, I'm going to kill all the Jews. And I'm going to give you the difference between reacting or responding. If I would have reacted, I would have dragged him to the corner And I would tell him, who do you think you're talking to? I saw my mother going to the gas chamber. But when people ask where was God in Auschwitz, I say God didn't kill my parents. God told me to really think about this boot boy, that he was brainwashed. So I went to God, what do I do with this boy? And you know what God told me? Find the bigot in you. And I said, no, 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 God, that's not true at all. I came to America in 1949. I worked in a factory, and I went to go to the bathroom, and I didn't want to lose much time because it was piecework, 7 cents a dozen. So I worked very fast because my husband ended up in a TB hospital. I was the breadwinner. My little girl was 2 years old. And there was a sign, colored bathroom. How do you think I felt after Nazi Germany, communist Russia? I come to America looking for democracy, and I realized there are 2 bathrooms. So what do we do? That's the question. What I did with the boot boy, I created an environment, as you and I are taught in psychology, that he could feel any feelings without the fear of being judged. And I looked at him as lovingly as I could. You know, I can kill you with my eyes. I can love you with my eyes. And I said, tell me more. And he never knew my history. And I worked with him as a mother would. And then I handed him over to a man with gray hair like you. I don't think a mother can make a boy into a man. Takes a man.
Oh, thanks for reminding me. I think we have time for one more question. And I'd like to actually reference what's probably the pivotal moment in your riveting book. But I want to begin it by sharing a situation that I had. I was once addressing a group of bereaved parents who lost children, young children, and predominantly from the Orthodox Jewish community. And I just mentioned in passing during my speech that in the years and years, and this is one area that I've really focused my specialty in terms of helping with parental loss of a child, then all the years and years and all the hundreds of members of the Orthodox Jewish community or other observant communities, religiously observant communities that lost children, that the number that lost their faith, that abandoned their religious practices, I could probably count on the finger of one hand. And I found it amazing that after such an enormous tragedy, that people would remain faithful and religious. And when I was done, a Hasidic woman came to me and she said to me, why are you so amazed? Where else are we going to turn? And I was reminded of that, or actually maybe I can share just one more story, which is a story from my mother. When my mother was deported to Theresienstadt, they were allowed to carry only what they could carry in their hands. So her mother and everybody else just grabbed blankets and food. My mother had this huge art book with the classic collection of art, and she grabbed that. And her mother started screaming at her, "This is what you're taking?" And her father, who was actually a Hasidic rabbi, which is pretty amazing, said, "No, she needs it. Let her take it." And I think it's the preservation of one's dignity, of one's of holding on to what's beautiful in the world during times like that are so difficult. Maybe I'll even reference one more story. I once had a very suicidal patient on the phone. I was covering for someone else, and I didn't even know the patient, and she was highly suicidal. And she was telling me, screaming at me and saying, Dr. Blumenthal, why should I live? Why should I live? And I was saying all the wrong things, which made her more desperate. And finally, at one point, I said to her, you know, my mother survived Auschwitz by watching the sunset. She said, if there's something that beautiful, it can't all be bad. And these stories I'm reminded of during, as I said, the riveting moment, I think, in your book is when you danced in front of Dr. Mengele. And I think for anyone, that, I mean, as I say it, it sends shivers down my spine. And I think we're all wondering, as we deal with what's so painful in the world, where did you find that ability to do something, to foist on that evil, on that horror, something so beautiful, something sublime as ballet? And it would be something that would be such, we would treasure to know as we help others in those predicaments.
Oh, thank you. I think that two things happen. And two things happen also when I worked with Vietnam veterans, that they were told one thing and they found another. And they were put in a place they were not prepared for. You know, Primo Levi jumped out of the window, and I always wondered if he could have seen you. Maybe he didn't have to take his life. But there is one thing he and I have in common. What kept me alive was my curiosity. I wanted to know what's going to happen next and never, ever gave up. Next is such a good word. A woman, you know, went out with this guy and he took off. And I told her, next, you know, because that doesn't mean there is something wrong with you. You know, he may not be his, you know, who he is, but yes, see, I think it's very important to think about your thinking and then pay attention what you're focusing on, so that what you focus on has to be in alignment to get you closer to the goal. Dancing for Dr. Mengele is, I talked to Viktor Frankl about it, and he told me that when he was tortured, he closed his eyes and he imagined that he is in a Viennese lecture hall, lecturing about the psychology of the concentration camp. And I said, I too closed my eyes when I danced for Dr. Mengele. And the music was Tchaikovsky, and I was dancing the Romeo and Juliet at the Budapest Opera House. So when I went to Budapest, that's the first place I went. First place I went in Budapest, and I traveled with Philip Zimbardo, and we were doing very good lecturing for people. Actually, I met a lot of rabbis, and Judaism is very much practiced. And I went to the synagogue where my sister was, and her Christian professor, Mr. Waldbauer, put on a uniform and smuggled my sister out and hid her until the end of the war. I was fortunate enough to be invited to New Zealand to talk to 2,800 people who risked their lives to save Jewish lives. So I think it's very important not to generalize. One of the largest Jewish population today in Europe is in Germany. So
I'm going to hand it over to David for questions at this point. So,
Dr. Siegert, first of all, You're an amazing, incredible, very, very young 94-year-old person. And we normally say that you should live to be 120.
Yes, like Moses.
I, for one, would like to say that you should live to be 220. You have a lot to share. Some of our listeners are commenting how they have read your book, The Choice, and how it has changed their life, and how honored they are to be able to see you and listen to you personally. You have said that there is no perfect family, and you cannot change the past. So the question is, how do you prepare for the future? I'd like to go back to a comment that you made to Dr. Blumenthal, that so many times when you stepped into the shower and you turned on the knob, you were wondering whether gas would come out. So many people are affected by some form of trauma in their life. And you were describing a trigger, an everyday event of taking a shower, which triggered your memory back to the gas chamber. And is water going to come out? Or are you going to die in that shower? Mm-hmm. How did you reframe yourself? How did you get over so you didn't have that thought every single day of your life? How did it happen?
I never forget what happened. I don't know what it means to overcome it. I don't know what that means. I don't overcome, I don't forget. I came to terms with it. And I call it my cherished wound. I left a piece of me in Auschwitz, but not the better part. I can change every moment. And so I want people to recognize that whatever they're doing now maybe needs a change, because change is synonymous with growth. You're not going to go back. There is no such thing. There is a new beginning. So think of yourself as being pregnant, and you give birth to the you that was meant to be free. And the other effort is free from the concentration camp that we create in our own minds, and the key is in your pocket. Reclaim your true self. If you had to be daddy's little girl and daddy's little angel, just remember, you may have married your father, or if not consciously, but you make your husband to be like your father. That I think you go to someone who can be a compassionate listener. And all I do is go under your skin and keep your feelings company. I never ask, how are you? I think that's the stupidest thing that you can do. People say, fine. And we were testing that when I was teaching psychology. This person, one of my students, said, I heard that in America people are hearing but not listening. I said, okay, test it out. Tomorrow morning, somebody's going to say hi to you, and very quietly you say, my mother died this morning. And guess what happened? The guy said, oh, fine. I'll see you later, honey. Oh, okay, I'll see you 4 o'clock after school. Had nothing to do with responding or listening. I think it's very good for you to listen to your voice, your inner voice. And I did that. And my God in Auschwitz was with me, guiding me from darkness to light, from prison to freedom. And the biggest prison is in your own mind. And the key is in your pocket.
Dr. Eger, you still have a book of poetry that you need to write. Reclaim your true self. Never ask your feelings how they are. I want to speak for a moment about survivor's guilt that someone is asking us and go back to
Yeah.
conversation that you had with Dr. Blumenthal when he asked you when you were standing online.
Yeah.
And certainly we as children of survivors and every other person who's not a child of survivors should understand and know this story about the left and the right. And you uttered the words, my mother.
Yeah.
And you wanted to say your sister.
Yeah.
So if there is a classic example of survivor's guilt, you described it to Dr. Blumenthal. How do you go forward in survivor's guilt? I didn't do enough for my mother. I didn't do enough for so-and-so. I didn't do enough for my children. How do you go through survivor's guilt and get to the next step?
You don't get through it. You don't get through it. I think you have a special place. I can only speak for myself because when I was starting to work with Vietnam veterans, it came to my realization that I'm not qualified because I didn't really know what to do with a 16-year-old girl. And I ran away from that because I just wanted to be a Yankee Doodle dandy, you see. And I think it's very important to really realize that it is important for you to go through the ages and stages. We psychologists, do a lot of work on Piaget and people like that who go from ages and stages of development. And maybe you're stuck. When you're stuck, you're constipated. And when you're constipated, concentrate on the movement. So ask yourself, what now? What now? Because I may be full of fear. You're not born with fear. How do you turn anxiety into excitement that no matter what happened, you could have died? I was very suicidal after I was liberated because I knew that my parents are not coming back. I heard that my boyfriend and we were going to go to Palestine. We're going to fight. We were very, very militaristic. And he was killed the day before the liberation. Reality hit me. There was no therapy. What do you mean therapy? No therapy. Yesterday, there is cannibalism, and today, I don't have a pair of shoes to go out. If somebody went out, he went to bed. And my aunt sent me packages, and one of them said, Crisco. Do you know what is Crisco? I had no idea what Crisco was until I realized that I'm sure my aunt sent it to me because it can be useful, but we never knew what it was good for. So how do you do the acknowledging that when you lose everything, you still have hope in hopelessness? And never say why me, but what now? And begin recognizing that your childhood ended possibly a long, long time ago, and find that little boy, because that little boy is crying and says, I need a good parent. And you show up for your little boy and go buy him an ice cream cone and say that I'm here and I'm never, ever going to let you go. A child needs to know that the world is a safe place because we have each other now. And that's all we have today. What we had in Auschwitz. All we had was each other then. If you were just for the me, you didn't make it. If you stole from the Nazis, you were a hero. But if you dared to take anything from anyone, you died. You died. No one wanted to touch you anymore. So we do need each other, hopefully, that we can empower each other with our differences, that you can be you and I can be I. And I'm glad that you are my colleague, and I hope to be your colleague. And I like to talk to you about that. I'm not a shrink, I'm a stretch, and you are too. You're giving people choices. The more choices you have, the less you're ever gonna feel like a victim. I'm not a victim, I'm not a victimizer either. I am a human being, and I'm climbing the mountain, and I'm slipping and climbing, but I never stop climbing.
Dr. Eger, one last question. One last question. We've spoken a lot about the past and the present. Let's talk about the future for 1 minute.
Yeah,
We as children of survivors,
yeah,
as you started the conversation,
yeah.
have grown up in our early years not hearing anything from our parents about the show or nothing. Some of us may have been 30, 40, 50 years old before we heard anything. And then the spigot opened up and our parents couldn't stop speaking because they wanted us to know and to remember. My question was posed by one of our hundreds of listeners. Is it a good thing for us to repeat our parents' stories to our children? Or are we in some way forcing this information on them that if they're interested, they could learn it on their own? And we as parents should not be saying, you should know the story, you have to know the story. What is the best way? Is it good to share the stories, or do you give children a choice? How does it work?
Get rid of the word should. That's the, some children are 10 years old and you tell them words like, sounds like you have cognitive dissonance. That kid will know what you're talking about. I think you need to meet that people where they are and then treat them as if they were what they're capable of becoming. And I think psychologists do that. We become very compassionate listeners, and I may put myself a little bit down and say, if I would have gone through what you have, I don't know if I would have been a survivor like you are. That you're not lying either, because it's much easier to die than to live. So should the stories to be repeated to the kids? Of course. You know, when I had my second child in Baltimore, Maryland, I drove to the hospital because my husband worked for a CPA and he didn't want to let him go unless he deducts the pay. So I drove myself to the hospital and they put me in a crib, you know. I had my first baby at home, Czechoslovakia. And so 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a nurse comes to my room and I say, How long do I have to suffer? And she said, you had your baby 4 hours ago. And I said, that's America. So you see, in Czechoslovakia, you brought the hospital home, and you had a woman who was trained to get that baby out, and it's just different things. But you can tell your child whatever you want to say, and then read it to yourself. Whether is this really the language that would be useful and whose needs are being met. If I have the need to be needed, I'm always going to find someone who has a need to be taken care of. That's what happens when you get married. People have faulty expectations. And you think you're going to have Romeo and Juliet. That doesn't exist at all. So people get a divorce very quickly in America, especially. I think it's important for you to say to the children, you know, there's one thing I know as a psychologist, that what comes out of your body doesn't make you ill. What stays in there does. And if you just take it out of your head and then shake it out like a mop, you feel better. Holding on to something is not really healthy for you, but you don't want to use your children for anything like that. But you ask permission to make a date, and then you start not anything other than where you think your children would be a good listener and not to talk more than maximum 20 minutes, and, you know, and then ask for feedback. And your child may say, you know, Dad, I have other things to worry about. I'm in love with this girl and she doesn't want to have anything to do with me. I want to talk about that. See, I think you have to know who you're talking to. We call it unfinished business. We call it that comes with your family of origin. And that's why it's important that we're not done. It ain't over until it's over. Who said that? Yogi Berra. Yeah, Yogi Berra. Good philosopher, very good philosopher.
Best.
Yeah, yeah.
Dr. Eger, do us a favor. When you have another 4 hours to talk, could you please let us know, because Dr. Blumenthal and I would like to continue this conversation for a couple of hours. It's been absolutely a privilege to have this conversation with you, to listen to you, to read your book. I made about 50 Post-its in your book with comments and thoughts.
Thank you very much. My second book is The Gift, because people called me after the choice that they want something more practical. So that's my second book. And the third one, hopefully, will be for teenagers. I want teenagers to know that they're not children anymore, they're not adults yet, and how do you go through this period to become a healthy adult and find your body, mind, and your spiritual dimension, and see how you want to be remembered. And I want to be remembered as someone who did everything in her power to know that will never happen again.
Amen, as they say in French.
I'd like to thank my colleagues
Right.
Sivi Ryder and Yitz Elman and Ari Kenigsberg for helping to organize this very special evening. To my colleague, Dr. Norman Blumenthal, Director of OHEL Zacta Family National Trauma Center, and
Thank
most of
you.
all, to Dr. Edith Eger. We wish you a long.
David, can I just interrupt for a second?
Dr. Blumenthal.
Some people are asking how they can access the recording, so if we could just mention that.
It'll be available to everyone who registered for this evening. We will also be sending out an evaluation, a post-evaluation survey later this evening or tomorrow, and everyone who signed on for this conversation will get the information about accessing the recording. Dr. Eger, we wish you well. It is a very early 5 p.m. in Los Angeles.
Oh, Hania, I will do everything in my power. I owe it to my parents to know that they didn't die in vain. Because my mother told me in the car, we don't know where we're going, we don't know what's going to happen. Just remember, no one can take away from you what you put in your mind. So I'm hoping that I will trigger something in you that you really want to tell your story to your children, grandchildren, because my book is in my great-grandson's living room table. I have 7 great-grandsons. That's the biggest gift, that they will say, the little boy calls me Gigi baby for great grandma, because I'm short. He's very short too, but I'm Gigi baby, and you are the children of survivors who, no matter what happened, they never gave up. Never give up, ever. Thank you so much. We'll do it again, hopefully. We'll do it again. Hopefully, we can do it sooner than later. I'm here for you. You're my colleagues. Shalom. Good night.
Have a good evening.
Good
Thank
night.
you very much.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much. Okay.
Thank you.